very honored to have, he's the Deputy Governor, the Bank of Canada, Mr. Lawrence Schembri, and this is actually his final public speech, final public appearance as Deputy Governor. Lucky man is going to be retiring. So yeah, we're honored to have him come and speak in his final appearance. I think that's pretty good. Where's my notes? Oh, yes. So he's going to talk about the Bank of Canada's journey as it seeks how best to contribute to economic reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and promote their economic inclusion and prosperity. So, Mr. Schembri, I'd invite you up on stage, please.
Thank you, Rennie, for the very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we are gathered is the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. So it's a pleasure to be here. I would also like to recognize that today is the National Day of Awareness and Action for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Gender Diverse People. You see the red dresses around, and thanks to NACCA for noting these things as well. I think it's important for us to remember this day. C'est pour moi un immense plaisir, honneur et un privilège d'avoir l'occasion de m'adresser à vous. I greatly admire the National Aboriginal Capitals Corporations Association and your dedication to supporting Indigenous prosperity and improving living standards for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit across Canada. The successful expansion of your lending to the Indigenous economy is a source of inspiration to many, and me included. In fact, over the past 3 decades, you have issued over 46,000 loans worth a total of $2.8 billion. These numbers are impressive, and these loans have made a huge contribution to the prosperity of the Indigenous economy in Canada. But we all know much more needs to be done. The Bank of Canada is committed to supporting you in these efforts. Fostering Indigenous inclusion falls squarely within the bank's mandate to promote the economic and well-being of our country and all the peoples within it. Taking concrete steps towards economic reconciliation is therefore our responsibility too. As a public national institution, we must show leadership. C'est le sujet que j'aimerais aborder ce matin. Over the next 2 years, the bank will reach out and listen to a wide range of Indigenous groups to define what economic reconciliation means for us and for our work. We will look to our existing partners, and hopefully many new ones, to guide us toward a common understanding of what our role should be. By embracing this process and taking the time to do it right, we hope that the bank can take a meaningful step towards building trust and strengthening our relationship with Indigenous peoples. In recent years, my colleagues and I have listened to Indigenous partners. We've learned a great deal about the history of the Indigenous economy, its potential, and its challenges and opportunities it currently faces. We've also begun to support the Indigenous economy through various means. But we need to become more deliberate in our approach. If we are going to advance economic reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, we need a plan to focus our efforts and guide our actions. To help restore the prosperity of the Indigenous economy, we want to become trusted partners with you. and we need to work together to overcome long-standing obstacles faced by Indigenous peoples and the discriminatory practices that contributed to them. Before contact with colonizers, Indigenous peoples had thriving economies, communities, and governance structures. Manny Jules is the Chief Commissioner of the First Nations Tax Commission. He's a driving force behind many of the financial innovations I'll be talking about today. At the Symposium on Indigenous Economies that we hosted last November, he described the state of the Indigenous economy before settlement. And his quote's on this slide. So he said, and I quote, "We paid taxes, had property rights, built and sustained public and economic infrastructure, had money, and created standards that supported vast and successful trading networks across the Americas. We used our jurisdiction to create public and community sector that supported many innovations in agriculture, land and resource management, products, transportation, science, math, and of course, art. The forces of colonization and assimilation brutally suppressed this vitality. But the Indigenous spirit proves resilient, and this conference is testament to that. We all share the responsibility to help restore this prosperity by advancing the objectives of economic reconciliation as recommended by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Indigenous peoples deserve equitable access to education, employment, and economic opportunity. The resulting benefits would be substantial for Indigenous communities because their standards of living would increase dramatically. All of Canada would also gain from from an Indigenous economy that is more empowered to realize its full potential. Several recent trends speak to the enormous potential of the Indigenous economy. For example, the Indigenous population in Canada is young and growing fast. Statistics Canada projects that the Indigenous population will grow by more than 50% by 2041, which is almost double the rate of the non-Indigenous population. The Indigenous population is also currently much younger, with just half being under the age of 25. On the jobs front, the number of employed Indigenous people grew by almost 45% in the decade between 2006 and 2016. Recent estimates for 2017 to 2021 show this trend continuing. Employment among off-reserve Indigenous people grew 5 times faster than non-Indigenous employment, as displayed in the first 2 bars of this chart. Oops, sorry. In terms of income, the 2016 census found that the median earnings of Indigenous people was 78% of that of the non-Indigenous population. The estimates shown in the second pair of bars indicate that weekly wages for Indigenous people living off reserve grew at a higher rate than those for the non-Indigenous population in recent years. Education, capacity building, and the economic opportunities generated by the creation and growth of Indigenous firms are critical to closing this income gap. Clearly, progress towards reconciliation will accelerate these trends. Recent improvements in education levels are also promising. The percentage of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit with a secondary school education or higher grew at a faster rate than that of non-Indigenous peoples. This development has continued over the past few years. The percentage of Indigenous people living off reserve with a university degree increased twice the rate of the non-Indigenous population, as shown in the last, as seen in the last set of bars in this chart. A recent study found that these education outcomes would be improved by providing better employment opportunities and a culturally sensitive learning environment and curriculum. In terms of business growth, the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business reports that the number of Indigenous entrepreneurs in Canada continues to rise. In fact, the increase in self-employment among Indigenous peoples has more than doubled that of the non-Indigenous population in recent years. Furthermore, Indigenous businesses, as we just heard, are performing well. Small and medium-sized enterprises in Indigenous communities export products and services at rates that are comparable or even higher than non-Indigenous small SMEs. Export participation is typically associated with businesses that advance productivity through innovation. In addition, many Indigenous firms are involved in environmentally sustainable activities. Now, I don't mean to gloss over many of the challenges that continue to hinder Indigenous prosperity. I simply want to stress that the tremendous untapped potential that still exists. This potential will only be realized when private firms and public agencies commit to economic reconciliation. The possible returns should be substantial, both for Indigenous communities and for our entire country. The challenges Indigenous peoples face when it comes to restoring their prosperity are the direct result of colonial policies. These policies violated their basic human rights and undermined their political and economic sovereignty. These policies have also led to geographic and economic isolation, financial dependence, and widespread poverty and suffering. I know you, the people in this room, are keenly aware of the obstacles that limit Indigenous economic inclusion, but more Canadians should understand them. Indigenous peoples face numerous barriers to accessing financial services, most notably credit and capital, compared to the non-Indigenous population in Canada. For example, by restricting rights, property rights, Section 89 of the Indian Act established legal barriers to accessing credit. Limiting access to credit has stunted the creation of new businesses and employment opportunities in First Nations communities. Bank of Canada research has found that remoteness and deficient infrastructure have contributed to limited access to cash, banks, and financial services more broadly. These barriers to financial inclusion and many others have increased the cost of living and led to a debilitating underinvestment in Indigenous communities. Research at NACCA has shown that a lack of access to debt and equity finance creates significant challenges for Indigenous entrepreneurs trying to start and grow their businesses. As a result, these entrepreneurs tend to rely on personal savings to finance their business ventures. Of all the capital financing provided in Canada in 2013, First Nations and Inuit businesses received only 0.2%, much less than 1%. Fortunately, Indigenous institutions have been established to reduce these barriers to financial inclusion. In particular, the First Nations Fiscal Management Act was passed in 2005. The resulting financial framework was designed by First Nations to enhance local revenue-raising powers of their communities. It was also designed to improve access to capital markets to help finance sorely needed infrastructure. This FNFMA framework consists of 3 institutions that collaborate to enhance the capacity of First Nations to access low-cost financing and develop a stronger climate for investment. The First Nations Tax Commission helps First Nations governments increase their flow of revenue. The First Nations Financial Management Board, meanwhile, helps First Nations adopt sound financial management practices and produce reliable financial information that can be used to assess their capacity to borrow and service debt. Finally, the third institution, the First Nations Financial Authority, combines the first two elements to help secure low-cost financing by collateralizing community revenue streams and issuing highly rated debentures to the market. This arrangement represents a First Nations-led framework to get around many of the systemic barriers that impede access to credit, investment, and development in First Nations communities. In fact, the FNFA's impressive track record has enabled First Nations governments to borrow at rates that are comparable to Canadian municipalities, as we can see in this chart. You can see that First Nations Financial Authority, the spreads relative to sovereigns is higher initially, the red line, relative to averages of other municipalities. But over time, as the success of the FNA continued, these rates actually declined by the average of other municipalities. So that's a tremendous success. Consequently, because of this success, over 300 First Nations, about half of the total, have opted to join this innovative and effective framework. Nonetheless, despite issuances from the FNFA totaling $1.6 billion, access to finance continues to be a significant issue to Indigenous communities. Huge investment gaps remain. A recent report estimated that First Nations communities face a $30 billion infrastructure deficit, including housing, roads, water treatment, internet access, health centers, and schools. The newly formed Mi'kmaq Coalition, a group of 7 Mi'kmaq communities in the Atlantic provinces, boasts one of the most compelling success stories to emerge from this unique financial framework. Its acquisition of 50% of Clearwater Seafoods represents the single largest Indigenous investment in the seafood industry. While this framework has helped First Nations communities obtain better access to capital, it is important to note that individual Indigenous firms, including Inuit, Métis, and First Nations, have not similarly benefited. Now, this is where NACCA comes in. The Aboriginal financial institutions that are part of the NACCA network have made great strides, as we just heard, in removing many of the historical obstacles to financing. They provide direct access to credit for many small and medium-sized Indigenous businesses. Since the first AFIs were founded some 40 years ago, the network that NACCA represents has been remarkably successful. By building trust and capacity across communities, the network has more than doubled new annual loan volumes, as you see on this chart, while keeping loss rates unusually very low as shown. So the line shows the loss rates, and you can see that they're on average well below 2%. At the same time, new loan volumes have more than doubled over the last 15 or so years. So that's an indication of the tremendous success that NACCA and the FI network has had. Now, why does this occur? Well, the success stems directly from how well these financial institutions, the AFIs, know their clients. Working closely to support their borrowers has helped them build strong relationships and a solid understanding of their needs and financial capacity. I'm highly optimistic that the new Indigenous Growth Fund, which was discussed yesterday at the forum, will also perform well under NACCA's visionary leadership. Now, despite these successes, more needs to be done to ensure that Indigenous governments, households, and businesses have comparable access to financial services. This is important because these barriers to financial markets have other negative effects. For example, they hinder the transmission of monetary policy to the Indigenous economy. So this chart helps illustrate this issue. And so it considers 4 times since 2000 when the Bank of Canada has cut interest rates to encourage borrowing and stimulate demand. And the chart shows that for the most part, during these periods, interest rates paid by Indigenous businesses on their loans from AFIs, shown in the green bars, did not fall as much as the bank's policy interest rate, shown in red. Nor did they drop as much as the prime interest rate charged by banks to their preferred lenders, which is in blue. This finding suggests that monetary policy has been less effective at stimulating the Indigenous economy than other parts of the Canadian economy. The main reason for this incomplete transmission of monetary policy is the lack of access to financial services, primarily limited access to market-determined borrowing rates. It is worth noting that during the most recent period of monetary policy easing during the pandemic in 2020-2021, the relatively large decline in interest earned by AFIs reflected the impact of government policies. These policies enabled AFIs to reduce interest rates during the pandemic. Of course, beyond these issues of access to finance, other barriers to Indigenous economic opportunity exist. For example, limited opportunities for education and skill development adversely affect employment and income outcomes. They also limit access to credit, firm creation, and economic development. Of particular concern is the fact that fewer Indigenous students are in fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics at only 40% of the Canadian rate. The Bank of Canada is trying to address these barriers by sponsoring Indigenous scholarships and internships. We also recognize that we must do better at hiring Indigenous staff, and we are committed to doing so. Meanwhile, attempts to measure the size and performance of the Indigenous economy in Canada are constrained by the availability and the quality of the data. This represents another important barrier to economic inclusion because inadequate information impairs financial management and decision-making. For example, the economic data are often unavailable at the community level and are not comparable across Indigenous communities or with the non-Indigenous population. But efforts are being made to close these information gaps. For example, the bank has partnered with the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, Global Affairs Canada, and Big River Analytics to conduct a large-scale survey of Indigenous businesses in 2021. This survey should help us better understand the composition of the Indigenous business sector and market conditions faced by Indigenous firms, both on and off reserve. A collaborative partnership has also been established between the 3 FNFMA institutions, Statistics Canada, the Bank of Canada, and the Tulo Centre. This collaboration seeks to empower Indigenous communities with improved financial statistics to enable effective decision-making. The intention is to expand the scope of this work to include Inuit and Métis communities as well. While progress is being made on several fronts, many obstacles continue to limit the potential of the Indigenous economy. I'm pleased to be among friends to announce the beginning of our journey, one that will take aim at these obstacles and help define what economic reconciliation means to the Bank of Canada, to Indigenous peoples, and to the broader Canadian economy. We'll start by talking to the people who know us best, the organizations we've already been working with. These include NACCA, the Tulo Centre, and the bank's Indigenous Advisory Circle. We will use these conversations with our friends to seek guidance on the main question of economic reconciliation. But we also invite them to suggest other Indigenous organizations and communities who may be interested in sharing their views. In this way, we hope to expand our circle of Indigenous partners. As these conversations evolve over time, the bank will reflect on what we are hearing. We will then work with our partners to prioritize actions and develop a formal reconciliation action plan, which will help us build on what we're currently doing. It is important that we take the time necessary to craft the right plan, with an aim to publishing it sometime in 2023. You recognize that this plan is simply the start of a longer journey toward reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. It will need to be updated over time. Last November, many of us in this room participated in the symposium on Indigenous economies that I mentioned earlier. Personally, I was very moved by this experience. A heightened spirit of cooperation permeated the sessions of the conference. This spirit, derived directly from the Indigenous perspective of commitment to the common good, was critical to the success of the symposium. It also offered an important lesson for our work going forward. Being open to learning from Indigenous experiences and incorporating Indigenous perspectives in many aspects of our work is vital. I hope this same spirit of openness, trust, and collaboration will inspire and drive our engagement over the next 2 years. As Renee just mentioned, I'll be retiring from the Bank of Canada in June, but I will not be retiring from my own personal efforts to support Indigenous economic inclusion and opportunity. I feel it's very important for the Indigenous communities and for Canada at large. I have been inspired and impressed by your wisdom and commitment. I have found my engagement with you on these important issues deeply enriching. I will forever be grateful for the guidance and support that you have kindly provided me during my stay at the bank. À l'heure où nous faisons ce prochain pas important sur le chemin de la réconciliation, nous accueillons avec plaisir vos réflexions sur les actions que la Banque peut prendre pour contribuer au bien-être économique et financier des communautés autochtones. As I just said in French, as we take this important step on our path toward reconciliation, we welcome your views on the actions we can take to contribute to the economic and financial well-being of Indigenous communities. I also invite you to hold us accountable for the commitments we are making. By working together, I'm convinced that we can over time make a significant and positive contribution to reconciliation. I'm also convinced that we can improve the welfare of the Indigenous communities in this country. Merci pour votre attention, votre amitié chaleureuse et votre générosité. Miigwech, merci et thank you.
So he has time for a couple of questions. If anybody has a question, you step up to the mic. Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Schembri? You can ask him what he's going to do once he retires.
You want me to answer that question?
Yeah, please.
Sure. Thanks, Renee. No, I'm pleased to give you a sense. Oh, there's Jean Bisson. I'll answer that question first, then I'll turn to Jean. Before I joined the Bank of Canada, I was a professor of economics at Carleton, and I hope to take the opportunity to go back to doing some teaching, and I hope to teach some classes of Indigenous students to bring them up to speed on their economics and also how the Bank of Canada works. So that's something I'm looking forward to doing, and I hope to be able to do that to work with Indigenous students. I find education extremely important to expanding their opportunities for employment in the future. So education is something that's always been a priority for me, and I hope to do more of that when I step away from the Bank of Canada.
First of all, Mr. Schembri, I would like to thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. Thank you very much, and I'm gonna say some additional words later on. Just a question here. We all know that First Nations have always had difficulties to access capital, and the kind of capital that we need, in my mind, is in the capital markets. How do you see the role of the government in order to facilitate, this link between the capital markets and the First Nations needs?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, the FNFA has been a tremendous success. I mean, the scale of their borrowing has, over time has increased, but it's small relative to the needs of the First Nations and Indigenous communities in Canada. I recognize that there's still very large investment gaps. There's needs for infrastructure, for education that I mentioned. So I agree entirely that there's still more to be done in terms of accessing capital markets. But I think there's been a lot of innovations, not only the FNFA, but also the Indigenous Growth Fund that we heard about yesterday. I think having private investors via the capital markets participate in the IGF will also potentially represent an opportunity to access more funding from capital markets. So I think there's more innovations that can be had in the future that will allow Indigenous businesses and communities to access capital markets on a more ready basis. As we've heard today, loss rates from Indigenous borrowing are extremely low. I think there's huge opportunities within these communities to generate returns that can pay on any borrowings from capital markets. So I think there are gaps there, but I'm optimistic these gaps can be closed. Yes, please, go ahead.
Good morning, I'm Helen Bobbywash. I am an accountant and I'm on the investment committee for the Indigenous Growth Fund. The Indigenous representation at the governance level I feel is really important, and my question is, when will the Bank of Canada have an Indigenous person on your board of directors?
That's a good question. The Indigenous Board of Directors is not something the bank itself controls. It's a selection made by the government, but I'm optimistic that an Indigenous board member will be named sometime in the near future. I don't know the details, but I think you've identified a clear need for us, and I think the government is aware of that need, and so I expect they'll make that kind of decision in the future. As I said, it's not in my hands, but you've identified a clear need for a board member on our board, and I think that's something that will be taken into consideration by the government in the future. Thanks for your question.
Thank you.
Other questions? C2? Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak in front of a live audience, and so thank you very much for your attention.